So in the previous videos, I talked about what Socratic Seminar is and why it's important. That's video 1. Video 2, we discussed kind of the basic setup of Socratic Seminar and the rule set. So in this video, hopefully by now you're sold on the process and you have some understanding of different ways that it can work. So in this video, I want to talk to you about choosing texts for Socratic Seminar, which is now one of the most important jobs for the teacher or professor who's going to be the facilitator of the seminar. Here are the 3 rules that I usually go by in choosing a text for Socratic Seminar. These are rules that I've gotten as tips from other people and rules that I've also come by from experience. So the 3 are this. First of all, the reading obviously needs to provide students with something to discuss. That seems like it's pretty obvious, but it is actually, it definitely narrows down your list of possible readings. Next, the reading should be not too short and not too long. I'll talk about that a little bit later and what I mean by it, and it may be different for different grade levels or different age groups. And number 3, you want the reading level to be something that's just beyond student capabilities. You don't want it to be a reading where the student can read it fairly easily and feel like they have everything they need without any attempt to really be able to understand and decipher what the author is talking about. So let's go over these in order. As I said before, rule number 1 seems like it would be pretty obvious, but it actually eliminates a fair amount of the kind of texts that we can use in a class. So the rule here is that whether you're doing a 10-minute seminar, 15, 20, whatever the length of your rounds, you want the reading to be something where students can read it in a way where they can bring something to the discussion. Then the type of reading that this obviously ends up excluding, and teachers and professors will appreciate this, is a standard textbook. In a standard textbook, you get a lot of facts thrown at you, and it's in fairly clear, if not maybe boring, text, but there's not going to be a whole lot to discuss. So in my context, I teach college-level teacher candidates, so future K-12 teachers. And there are a lot of texts that are, let's say, textbooks on how human motivation works, the science behind human motivation, or the science behind human learning, or maybe learning theories. And a lot of these are presented in a way where here are the facts, here are the citations, the sources. It's going to be really awkward and intimidating and difficult for students to come in and feel like they can challenge certain points or that there are points that they want to challenge. So another type of reading that will be difficult to discuss is a reading where the point that's being made is just plain obvious. Something that no one would disagree with, that no one in their right minds would look at and say, this is worth bringing in for discussion, this point here, I want to dispute it, or I want to talk about this point a little bit more. So anything where the reading just doesn't seem like it's going to be at all controversial or give you something that's ambiguous or something like that is going to be hard. You want to pick things that are a little bit either ambiguous or position articles that are maybe challenging, where an author is arguing a case and you want to kind of use the discussion to analyze the case. Rule number 2 is sort of the Goldilocks principle. You want to look at the length of your reading very carefully. And you don't want it to be too long, but you don't want it to be too short. So you want to think about the capabilities of your students. What is a realistic expectation for them to read? So I have college students and a lot of professors like to assign 30 plus to 50 pages per class as reading. But I'm going to say that you want to take your expectation of what's typical to expect of your students, and you don't want to go much shorter than that, but you want to go shorter than what the typical expectation is. And so when I say that my students professors tend to expect, between 30 and 50 pages, I really like to assign about 20, and I don't like to go beyond that. If anything, I like to err on the side of shorter. So I find that if you give students really long readings, 2 things will happen. The first is they won't read very carefully. And for Socratic Seminar, you want students to read, but you want them to read very carefully. Now, it may be that they don't read very carefully anyway, even if you do a shorter reading, but you'll have to figure out ways to kind of make sure that they do read carefully. And my experience is that after a few seminars where they really see how in-depth the discussion goes, they will just automatically read more carefully, and my students have kind of told me, generally speaking, that they do read a bit more carefully. Another thing that occurs when the reading is too long is that it's often too long because there's a lot of stuff being covered in that reading. So it goes from here to there to there to there, which is why it's a longer reading. And the problem with that is that there's usually too much to discuss. So even in a 20-minute round for Socratic seminar, which if you've never done a seminar before sounds like a really long time, a longer reading that goes from this point to this point to this point to another point will often end up being too much, and students just won't have a lot to really focus on. There's just too many places it can go. All right, let's go to the third thing on the list. The third thing on the list is that you want the reading ideally to be something that's maybe just beyond what any individual student can understand. So this isn't a hard and fast principle, as you'll see from my examples later. But it was told to me by someone when I was thinking about doing Socratic seminar, and they'd give me some advice. They said you really want the readings to be just beyond their reading level. And part of the reason for that is that, number one, people will usually read a bit more carefully if there's a bit of nuance in the reading, which sounds kind of counterintuitive. You'd think that they would dismiss the reading. But if it's just above their ability level and they know they're going to be discussing it, there's a lot more incentive for them to really dig into the reading really carefully. But the second thing is that brings in a lot of stuff to discuss. So sometimes the best discussion questions are a student saying, you know, I'm confused when the author says this. I think they mean this, but what do you all think? What's your impression? So it really gets people comfortable with sharing those types of things in a group. And what students usually find, at least my students have, is that a lot of people reading the same reading, even if everyone doesn't quite get every part of the reading, Susie gets this part of the reading, and Sam gets this part of the reading, and Deshaun gets this part of the reading. So when everyone puts it together by the end of the seminar, it turns out really well. So you often really do want a reading that's kind of just above their reading levels. And that brings us to some examples. So I want to show you two examples of texts that I've chosen for my courses and just walk you through why I chose the text, so what my thinking was, and where these texts fall on these three rules. And you know, this is for a college course, so feel free, obviously, to adapt my thinking to what fits for your subject area and context. So the first book I want to bring in is a book that I assigned to a group of seniors that focuses on learning theory. This is a book by Frank Smith. It's called The Book of Learning and Forgetting. As you can see, the book is pretty short. It's about 110 pages overall, actually 130 overall. So I have students between several different class sessions reading this entire book. So let's walk through the list. One thing this book does not do very well, and this is one thing I had to consider, is that Frank Smith, to his credit in a lot of ways, is a very clear writer. He has a case that he's making about how learning works, and he makes it very directly in very simple language, and it's very easy to understand. So this text is certainly not above the reading level of my students. So that, when I originally thought about it for my class, gave me a little concern, because it seems like students would not have any discussions about what does he mean by this statement. I'm not sure. His meanings are pretty obvious. But where does it fall in the other areas of the list? So one thing this book has going for it is that the chapters are very short. And when I say they're very short, the chapters are usually about 10 pages each. So if anything, I assign 2 chapters per class period, which doesn't give you too much, because the Smith's argument throughout the book is very focused. He makes one particular case about how learning works, and each chapter is like the next step in the argument, which is kind of intriguing for a Socratic seminar, because if you give 2 chapters, now you've given 2 steps to his argument. So there's not too much there. There's enough to talk about, but it doesn't go all over the place. And each week is about 20-some pages of reading, which is pretty good in my experience discussing this book. So the third thing, which is part 1, the rule number 1, which is there has to be something to discuss. This book does a really good job of that, and here's why. Frank Smith, again, is making a case about how learning works, and each chapter walks you through a step. But Smith sometimes does a really poor job, frankly, arguing for his points. He'll make a point, and he'll just kind of let it sit there, and he'll move on to another point without really exploring the point that he made. The second thing that makes it really good is that some of his points are pretty controversial. So he makes a point, for instance, that all learning, when done correctly, is supposed to be easy. If it's difficult, he thinks that there's something bad about the instruction or something being taught. That's a pretty controversial point. So when I read this book, one of the things I think about that makes it a good book is, wow, so first of all, Frank Smith's making some pretty controversial points. And when students start thinking about, do I agree with the points that he's making, or do I disagree, or where do I agree and disagree? That is the stuff that is great for Socratic seminar discussion. The second book that I use for the same class that I've used before is very different from Frank Smith's book. It's a book by James Paul Gee, and it's called What Video Games Can Teach Us About Learning and Literacy. This book is a book that applies video game principles to learning. Its point is that video game design illustrates really good learning principles. So each chapter he talks about a new learning principle that is deeply embedded in video games. He walks us through some examples in video games, and then he tells us why this is a good learning principle. So there's a few things that make this book really interesting. And I will start with what the book does not do very well. So one of the things the book does not do very well for Socratic Seminar is the length of the chapters is a bit hard to assign. So to give you an example, chapter 2 starts on page 50 and chapter 3 starts on page 50 and chapter 4 starts on page 72. So there's a 22-page chapter, which is really a good length. But between chapter 4 and chapter 5 is page 72 to page 112. So you have a 40-plus page chapter, which is just way too much. So I can either split the chapter up and assign chapter 4 part 1 in one session and chapter 4 part 2 in another session, which doesn't really work too well because the chapter is not easy to split. Or I can assign one chapter, that 40-some page chapter, per class period. I've done that before, and I've done it between a Thursday and a Tuesday, so you have all weekend. But even then, there's just a lot going on in each chapter. The other thing that makes the book fairly difficult is there is a focus on video games. So I explain to students the section that walks you through the video games and how the video games illustrate certain learning principles. You can kind of skim through that because maybe some of you aren't video gamers, and it's going to be kind of hard to figure out, like, what is this video game about if I've never seen it before, stuff like that. But on the flip side, what makes this book a really good discussion book and why I keep it even despite the fact that the chapters are kind of strange sizes and stuff, is that it gives you a lot to think about in the following way. The book is about learning, but the book isn't necessarily about K-12 learning, which is what my students are thinking about. So the book is about learning as embedded in video game principles. So here's a video game that embodies this wonderful learning principle, and here's why it's a great learning principle. And he doesn't do a lot to say, here's how we can apply that information to K-12. So when we do discussions, it works out really well because a lot of the student discussion is, okay, so here's this learning principle that G talks about, but he doesn't really apply it to K-12. So here's how I think it applies. What do you all think? And then everyone can kind of say their piece on whether that principle applies to classrooms and how it might apply to classrooms. So those are examples that I've used in my college classrooms, but obviously if you're a middle school or high school teacher, take what I've just said and apply it to your own situation. But hopefully these 3 rules give you something to go on in terms of good Socratic seminar texts. And the texts are so important. So number 1, you want it to be something that has discussion in it. Number 2, you don't want it to be too long and too short. And number 3, you ideally want the reading level to be just above what you think individual students on their own might be capable of. In the next video, we'll talk about the next step. Now that you have your text, how do you create good discussion questions so that you can either get the ball rolling in your Socratic seminars or lead the Socratic seminar?